Begin.
Sign language interpreting and space travel. What will the future hold? First thing to understand is accessibility. What is accessibility? Well, simply stated, it is something that makes it so that everyone can do something that they want to achieve. As seen here, these are potential astronauts or potential space explorers, all of whom have some form of accessibility impairment or who need an adaptation to achieve their goal. I'm going to be focusing on sign language, so we have to define some terms. Someone's first language may be referred to as their L1. Someone who is deaf or hard of hearing may be abbreviated to D/H lowercase h. This simply means that this is simply a shorthand way of explaining. Although not everyone who is deaf or hard of hearing uses sign language as their L1 or needs an interpreter, many do. And that is why it's important to understand interpreting and to use it in the context of astronauts who are deaf or hard of hearing. So what is interpreting, first of all? Well, Essex Community College describes it as a specially trained professional whose job it is to convey the messages of people who do not share the same language, culture, or mode of communication. That makes sense, I believe. Well, language, right? American Sign Language is what we're going to be focusing on, and the important part of American Sign Language is that it is a language. It's not simply signed English, it is in fact its own language with its own Stantex, dialects, and even regional variations. In fact, you might be able to figure out where someone learned to sign by how they form their signs. Or you would look at sentence structure to determine different forms of sign. And now we have to find out what the gap of knowledge is for sign language and space travel. There are 4 separate sources to look at, each of which builds on previous ones and iterations in order to build an understanding. The first is about Lit 11. These are 11 deaf men who helped build the foundation of space travel and the space industry. Back in the early days of space travel, when we were just starting to figure out how, these 11 men, most of whom had an inner ear disorder, which caused them to go deaf early in life, who, because of that inner ear disorder, did not experience dizziness, which is something that also would not be experienced in space due to microgravity. This allowed NASA and the researchers to test basically microgravity and spinning and different disorientations without worrying about the disorientation that would occur to a normal human. This allowed them to test microgravity, and as seen in this image, they used sign language to communicate. This shows that even in the earliest days of the space industry, sign language, ASL, and universal accessibility was a factor. However, they were not necessarily on active missions aside from this research, nor was sign language interpreting a massive part of the research that was being conducted. Next, well, if they weren't necessarily a part of the research being conducted or active missions, has sign language ever been used on the ISS, the International Space Station? Well, the answer is yes. First, by this man, his name was William Reddy. He did this first American Sign Language address aboard the ISS. And second, by this woman, a woman named Tracy Caldwell Dyson. These 2 addresses are both people whose L1 is spoken English rather than American Sign Language, who performed addresses to demonstrate how sign language could work aboard the ISS and to basically a proof of concept. The reason that this is significant is not only are they trying to show and encourage deaf or hard of hearing astronauts and deaf or hard of hearing kids to participate in science experiments and to become astronauts, but it also demonstrates the use of ASL in microgravity, important experiments and important concepts to understand when going forward. However, it does not show interpreting or how interpreting could function, aside from simply recording and looking at the recording back. Next, Joanna Leckert, NASA's first deaf engineer on an active mission. She used sign language to communicate over an active mission. This means that she actually had to have an interpreter with her while the mission was going on. This demonstrates how interpreters can work during active NASA missions. This also demonstrates an interesting slight miscommunication and how they were able to overcome it. However, this was a ground-based mission, and it was also entirely virtual, meaning that there was no direct in-person communication between the engineer and the actual crew aboard the plane that was flying. Finally, Astro Access, a familiar photo, but Astro Access is a group focused on advancing disability inclusion in space travel. This group had 12 ambassadors who took part in a zero-gravity flight that went up and went down to simulate zero gravity and cause zero gravity, and did experiments. Of these 12 individuals, 2 were deaf or hard of hearing. Their experiments focused on microgravity and sign language and how it could be performed. It did not, however, focus on interpreting. Their amazing research paved the way for future accessibility grants and things of that nature. But all of this brings me to my research question. What are the future potential limitations and challenges that might be faced by ASL interpreters in relation to space travel and deaf or hard of hearing astronauts? As we've seen, all of these sources did not in fact discuss interpreting. It did not in fact talk about what an interpreter could do. This is not the fault of the sources, as they were not focusing on this aspect, but it is a massive knowledge gap that should be addressed. Well, in order to understand how, we first must look at my methods, what I did to understand this. As I was looking towards the future, I did a Delphi study. This involved making surveys, analyzing my results, and then repeating this, sending it to a panel of experts to understand and reach a consensus of what would happen in the future. I, at first, had a total of 4 panelists, although by the end of my 3 rounds of research, one of which dropped out, leaving me with 3 total experts. These experts were professional sign language interpreters, some of whom had actually worked for NASA previously, and they were all able to help me reach my consensus. Now, on to what I was able to gather from this. As I had 3 rounds, I had to specifically choose what I wanted to look at. Most of my data comes from my 3rd round, as that is my consensus. However, there is some information that either did not need to be repeated, as it had come to a consensus almost immediately, or was simply stated in previous rounds. As such, my 1st round gathered that 100% of, all 4 individuals stated that sign language interpreting was going to be necessary for deaf or hard of hearing astronauts, or most likely was going to be. They also stated that 50% of them said that virtual interpreting from Earth to space was ideal. This was in the 2nd round. And 25%, or 1 each, said that in-person or a combination of the 2 would be best. However, as my study focused primarily on what challenges would be faced and reaching a consensus, this information dropped off on the 2nd round, and my primary focus was those challenges. Speaking of, I had a set of sentence conclusions. These conclusions were reached on a consensus with the rating scale of 1 to 10 on a Likert scale, with 1 being the least a level of agreement and 10 being the most. The first of which was the definition of sign language interpreting: facilitating equal communication, ensuring universal access, understanding, and crossing cultural gaps, receiving a 9.3, which aligns fairly well with the Essex definition of interpreting we saw earlier. Second was that interpreters may be important to better allow astronauts to communicate using their L1 so that they may perform all necessary duties. This achieved a rank of 9 out of 10, though all of the accompanying data released comments saying that I should switch the word maybe to are important, which was an interesting contradiction to previous data. This also explains that facilitating communication in primary languages or first languages, or L1s, are universally important. Finally, we had the discussion of nonverbal communication devices, or AACs, which was universally said they would not necessarily be beneficial, as they could not discuss body language, facial expressions, or other things that are very important to visual languages such as ASL. Onto my list of challenges. Each was given a weight on a scale of 1 to 10, and then was rated at how much they agreed with those weights. The first was thick or bulky gloves, which was given at 7.75. The majority strongly agreeing with this conclusion. The reason is because, to quote one of my panelists, performing sign language in regular gloves is very difficult. To perform in astronaut gloves would be nearly impossible. This is because sign language requires incredibly precise movements, and the thick gloves that astronauts wear makes it difficult to perform everyday tasks, let alone sign language. The next is line of sight. As stated, sign language is a visual language, so having a disconnect between line of sight would make it almost impossible to see what you're communicating with. Finally, resources. Though a vague word, there was too little time to fully figure out what resources would exactly be missing. So resources was given a rank of 7.75, and the majority of my panelists agreed. Next was computers. Though this would be primarily an issue with virtual interpreting from Earth to space, we can still see the struggles that computers would face. A lack of computers would be a lack of ability to even communicate, or latency. The delay in communication between space and Earth is enough time to completely miss out on at least a single sign, if not more, which could completely shift the message of a sentence or more, leading to issues with communication that could cause challenges in both fixing issues or even life or death situations if an emergency arises. Finally, room to move. Though this is not as much of a challenge, hence its lowest rank, it is still a high level of concern. All of the 6 concerns I gathered are treated a rank of at least 5, which does make a bit of sense. So what does all this mean? Well, it means, first of all, that I was able to gather a list of potential challenges that had not been previously seen or understood by the scientific community, and addressed a certain gap in knowledge of what ASL interpreting could potentially look like in space. I was able to gather a consensus on what supplements may or may not be available, such as nonverbal communication devices, and build a basic foundation. I was not able to gather solutions, but it is a good starting place for future research. Speaking of, where do we go from here? Well, future researchers would want to build on this information. First, likely having more rounds to reach a further consensus and achieve greater coherence. What are resources? Have a better definition of nonverbal communication devices so the intent is clear. To have more discussions, have more panelists so that have a more diverse range of opinions and conclusions. And finally, have more time to further edit and understand the gap in knowledge and what the discussions are. All of this means that I have built a foundation of knowledge in a massive research gap. I hope that I've been able to start closing it, but there is still far more to go. Thank you.
Okay, we'll move on to the oral defense questions now. My question for you is, how did you determine which results generated by your research method were most important in informing your new understanding?
This was a very difficult one to answer, as I had 3 rounds of surveys, so I had quite a bit of data. In the end, I was able to determine that the questions that most answered my research question, what challenges or issues could be faced by sign language interpreters in space, was the most significant. So, for example, my 6 challenges with the Likert scaled weights and how much they were agreed with was the most significant, as well as slight supplementary information such as the nonverbal communication devices, as they could potentially be a solution to that question, was the most important. In the end, as long as it was most aligned with my research question, I determined that it was the most important.
Thank you.
Okay. How did the limitations of your method or data influence your new understanding?
As I chose a Delphi study, which involves multiple rounds of research and takes quite a bit of time, I had a lot of issues with time management and with thoroughly explaining everything. I ran into trouble almost immediately with the repetitiveness in my IRB and analyzation. So what I found was that I was unable to adequately explain certain topics. For example, the nonverbal communication device, I was not able to adequately explain that quite a few of them do actually take into account body language and facial expression and are in fact designed to do so. So when my panelists said that they would be unlikely to be a solution because specifically they would not take that into account, I realized that 1, I had not adequately explained what they are, unless they had already had previous context, which I was not sure if they did. And two, I did not have time to go back and fix that statement, as I had to move on to supplementary rounds, and I only had 3 rounds to reach a consensus. So I was left unable to do that. So I believe that limitations in time and the amount of rounds that I was left with was highly influential of my conclusions.
If you could revisit your research project, what would you do differently and why?
I would streamline the process immediately. That is the first thing I would do. As I mentioned, I had quite a bit of trouble with time and organization and explaining things properly. If I could revisit, I would more adequately write explanations for different topics or ideas. I would streamline the process so that I could get my surveys out faster and have them be more accurate and have them be more thorough. When I started the project, I was hoping that I could get it done quickly, and I was hoping that I could get 5 rounds in. I was only able to do 3, which works very well, but if I had streamlined it a bit more, I believe I could have at least gotten 4. So streamlining it, taking the time to analyze my surveys a little bit more thoroughly and explain things would have been incredibly beneficial to me, I believe.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.